home of Robert C. Rendtorff, who has had a long and distinguished career at the University of Tennessee, but he is now retired and has been very active in affairs outside of the university as well as the university. Bob, I want to ask you if you will give us a little bit about where you were born, where you went to school, professional schools, what your degrees were, and what your interests were, and then how you got to Memphis.
Thank you, Bill. I was born in Carlisle, Pennsylvania, on the grounds of the Carlisle Indian School. My father was a physician there. And that was a time when Jim Thorpe and Pop Warner were with the Carlisle Indians, a famous football team. But we moved, the family moved to Maywood, Illinois, which is a western suburb of Chicago, where I grew up and went to school. I went to the University of Illinois in Urbana-Champaign and got an AB and an MS degree in entomology. I stayed on for a year there after my master's degree, and then had a chance to go to School of Hygiene and Public Health at Johns Hopkins in Baltimore with Dr. Robert Hegner, famous zoologist and protozoologist. From there, after working on my doctor's degree thesis, I went to the new viral lab at the University of Michigan in Ann Arbor. Dr. Tommy Francis Jr. was the head of the group there, and I was a member of a group which went to study the epidemiology of poliomyelitis. In those days, big outbreaks of polio occurred, and we had no idea how it was spread from one to another. And this laboratory, perhaps more than any other, investigated the epidemiology of polio in those days. From there, I went back to medical school at Hopkins, and they were supposed to let me out in 3 years, but the war ended, and we had a timeout period where we went back to the old schedule from the accelerated schedule. I think you went through the accelerated schedule. I spent some time doing some research in malaria for the government of Venezuela, in Maracay, Venezuela. A very interesting time in my life. And came back and finished medical school, but only after having come down with hepatitis and a 3-month stay in the hospital here at Hopkins. And I lost actually a year of medical school, so it took me 5 years actually to get through. But then I went into the public health service and interned in the Marine Hospital, a public health service hospital in Baltimore. I had a very interesting internship because all the heads of the departments were going into the new clinical center and were stationed in Baltimore temporarily. Luther Terry, the Surgeon General who initiated the tobacco problems, pointed them out, I might say, was my chief of medicine. And there are other well-known people in that hospital at that time. I stayed in the public health service and was joined the Laboratory of Tropical Diseases of the National Institutes of Health. I was assigned after my internship to a prison in Seagoville, Texas, which was an experimental prison, a prison without walls, where we did some basic work on prisoner volunteers in the realm of epidemiology of intestinal protozoan parasites. This work has received national and international attention because it could not be repeated, but at that time we were able to do these studies in the prisoner volunteers. I went from Texas to Columbia, South Carolina, in the malaria laboratory there, and stayed for a couple of years, after which time I left and came to Tennessee. This was in 1955, and Tennessee in those days was just beginning to open up into a new area. The new Gaylor Hospital was built, and the Department of Preventive Medicine, which is a relatively small department, had the first floor rooms in Gaylor Hospital. Dr. Henry Packer was the head, and he had done some outstanding work first in minor venereal diseases, for which he was known internationally, and also had done some work during the war with a group at Tennessee in malaria and developing a new drug, chloroquine. When I got there, I had a couple of my friends from Hopkins that preceded me. Both stayed for a year or two in the Department of Preventive Medicine, teaching parasitology. And I was hired to teach parasitology, and this I did for almost the full time I was there.
What year did you come to the University of Tennessee? 1955. All right. Okay.
And in those days, there was a fire station on the corner of Madison and Dunlap, and the Christian Science church occupied the opposite corner, and across the street from the fire station was a cancer research building. Well, I started out, in Columbia, I had gotten interested in tissue culture work, virology, and coming to Tennessee, I again initiated a tissue culture laboratory and a virus laboratory. This eventually grew to where we occupied all but I think 2 rooms of the first floor of the cancer research building. We had a monkey colony on the roof, which very few people knew about. But what we would do was operate on the monkeys and take out one kidney and make our tissue cultures. And then after a while, when we needed the second kidney, we would sacrifice the animal and use his other kidney for tissue cultures. This was an interesting time. At the time, it was the largest virology lab in the Mid-South area. There was one down in New Orleans and at Tulane, and one in Atlanta with the NIH, CDC rather. But we were probably one of the biggest viral laboratories. And we investigated, we started out investigating the common cold or upper respiratory diseases in a group of orphanage children at St. Peter's here on Poplar. We had a number, quite a few papers published on uncovering the epidemiology of these new viruses. Originally, the common cold was thought perhaps to be a single virus, but it turned out, as we know today, that it amounts to hundreds of viruses. The adenoviruses were the first group to be studied, parainfluenza, Coxsackie, and many others followed, and we wrote papers in regard to the epidemiology of these various viruses that cause upper respiratory problems in young children. At the same time, I was involved in a number of other activities beside the work in the virus lab. We had about 15 people working there at one time in collaborative manners, and technicians and so forth to do this work.
Bob, how is this laboratory supported?
From a grant from the National Institutes of Health.
Okay. So you must have been one of the bigger early grantees in our school.
We probably were the biggest.
Okay.
I'm not saying that in a bragging fashion.
No, it's just a factual thing.
It was true. It was probably the biggest. And Dr. Henry Packer is responsible for a lot of the administrative aspects of obtaining grant, but we actually wrote them and carried them out. I was also active in the health department, and originally was hired to help with the epidemiological problems they had there in terms of acute communicable diseases, food poisoning outbreaks, and so forth. And we had a number of very interesting outbreaks in Memphis that I was involved in, not necessarily the primary author, but involved in one way or another. I sometimes called in the Center for Disease Control for help in these outbreaks. We had a large outbreak of St. Louis encephalitis. We had the Legionnaires outbreak in Baptist Hospital, which is a large, well, the outbreak wasn't that large, but it was certainly an important one because it was the first time that water was shown to be a vector of the organism. We went on from these outbreaks. We also had an outbreak of, actually it was a 3-state outbreak of diseases associated with milk. So I was in on a number of these, not necessarily the primary investigator, but involved in the activities to solve these problems. One of the things I meant to mention earlier that I'm very proud of, and had never had any public recognition in any way that I know of, was that I was one of the first doctors in the country, if not the world, to use measles vaccine to protect children. This was in cooperation with Dr. Anton Schwartz, who developed the vaccine and is still used. Schwartz strain of measles vaccine. And we were, I think, the second physician in the country to be using the Schwartz's modified strains in children. It it was a kind of rough going at times, because sometimes we had very sick children, but it turned out that we had a outbreak among these children, and it showed for the first time that every child who had the vaccine escaped the measles, and every child who did not get the vaccine came down with the measles. So after that, of course, we had the great national measles campaign, where the vaccine was widely used.
And this has reduced the occurrence of measles greatly in this country. Tell me, was this the kind of measles that that during pregnancy there's a problem with defective offspring, or is this that's a different one?
This is rubiola.
This is rubiola. All right.
But it certainly was a major breakthrough to have these vaccines. What else can I talk about? Let's see.
Well, let us go back a little bit. Tell us about your course in parasitology. I know that this was it was still a subject of great importance. Still is. I mean, the world over the world. But in terms of your contribution there, tell us about what you did and how you presented it and this sort of thing.
Well, I can't remember how things went all together, but when I first came here, parasitology was a major course in the clinical departments, which preventive medicine was associated. We had a 4-hour course, of which the first hour was taken up by lectures that I gave, and 3 hours of laboratory work. Well, I saw that this was wearing the students out, the 3-hour laboratory, and I condensed it to a 2-hour laboratory, which is still quite a bit for students in one day. But this was before the Vietnamese War, and it was interesting to me that on a world trip, I got out from, I stayed overnight in a hotel in New Delhi. I was going on to Kabul in Afghanistan, and I went in for breakfast in a restaurant, and somebody called out my name, which was a great surprise to me. It turned out to be one of my students who was in Vietnam, and he told me that our laboratory syllabus that we developed in our teaching of the parasitology course was reproduced and widely distributed throughout Vietnam.
How about that?
There was some. After we closed down the viral operations, we had a contract with the CDC again. This wasn't a grant, but a contract situation to study the economic consequences of gonorrhea in the female. This became known as the Memphis study, and major work was done by Dr. James Kern, who is now heading the AIDS program at the CDC in Atlanta. This study took me to Geneva, to report at the World Health Organization on our work, and the study was very well known and accounted for a new approach to controlling gonorrhea in hospitals and clinics throughout the country.
I'm sorry, establishes that this is a very prevalent form of venereal disease and quite debilitating, as well as quite an economic burden. And certainly for what you did, because I was there at the time that you were doing this part of your work, and it certainly was monumental. And I think that, as you say, it didn't establish, it was not recognized as being as important as indeed it was. And I just wanted you to know that it's since that time we still have references to that work, and it's and the AIDS came along some years after that, in which your associate, his name was Kerr, was it?
Current.
Current, yeah, that's right. And it was interesting because particularly several years ago we saw him on television a lot. I don't know whether you saw. He was trying to get across, answer questions of the press. The other thing that you did, which was many things that which you did that was important, but one of them that you haven't commented on, that you were the first epidemiologist, hospital epidemiologist. I know both at the City of Memphis Hospital and at the Baptist Hospital, and perhaps other hospitals too. But you were a pioneer in this area too. You want to tell us about how that worked and
Well,
what you did with that?
That was interesting, and I got in on the ground floor there. I think the group here in Memphis of, there were 3 or 4 hospitals, formed, I think, the 6th or the 8th chapter of APIC, Association of Practitioners of Infection Control, which grew to be a large association throughout the country. We got in on the ground floor of this, and actually I was on the infection control committees of practically every hospital in Memphis. St. Jude, St. Joe, City of Memphis, Le Bonheur, Baptist, and Methodist. At one time or another, I was a member of those committees. After I retired from the university...
And when was that, Bob? What year did you retire?
Well, I retired, let's see, in 1980. And of course, some of this was before that time. But after I retired, I retained positions as consulting epidemiologist in infection control for Baptist and St. Joseph Hospital. And this brought me, well, this is the reason we were involved in the Legionnaire's disease outbreak at Baptist Hospital. It was a very interesting outbreak, and the way it was handled, I think, was exemplary. At the same time we had the outbreak at Baptist, there was a hospital in the east, I believe New Jersey, that was closed down because they had one case. Turns out it really wasn't one case. They had another hospital, I believe, in New York, where they thought they had a Legionnaire's disease outbreak, and they went so far as to spray the streets with carbolic acid.
So it goes back to the days, early days of Lister.
Right.
Okay.
And it turned out that that was not really an outbreak at all. But our outbreak was a true outbreak, and Dr. Richard Kelly and Winston Reisel were involved in the laboratories of Baptist Hospital. They were the ones that isolated the Legionella from the cooling towers that distributed the fog outside the hospital. It was sucked into the hospital, in particularly one area, and caused these cases to occur. There was one case outside of the hospital, somebody just walking down the street came down. But this was the first time water transmission of Legionella was proven. And the laboratory workers, Kelly and Reitzel, are to be congratulated for their work at that.
Well, I think that I had one of the cases that occurred at that time. You know, we took call. I was on the medical staff there at the Baptist, and we took call, and we accepted any patient when we were on call that came in, and one of them was indeed a man who had been exposed to that situation there at the Baptist. I think he had a relative that he was coming in to see often, and indeed I think that's what he had. I didn't recognize it initially, but it turned out that that's what he had. But we recognized it soon enough that we were able to give him appropriate treatment, and he survived.
One thing about that outbreak is you have to commend the people in administration of Baptist Hospital, because that was, at the time these outbreaks in the East were occurring with such drastic measures of control, we were able to keep things on an even keel, and Baptist Hospital did not lose any admissions. In other words, there was no hysteria developed, and that was due to good PR work, public relations work. Mr. Maurice Elliott at that time was associated with Baptist, and he arranged for television and radio and news medium to be informed daily on the progress. I think this made a great difference because of the way the press was handled and the media was handled in face of the outbreak.
Now, you were on television, too, in relation to that outbreak, weren't you?
Yes, I was, and I used to be frequently on television in relation to
the health department.
Health department.
Yeah, tell us about that, because you got into some real controversial situation with that supposed area that had a chemical contamination, and that woman
Steel Street.
Okay.
We'll call it. She lived on Steel Street, and this put me in a very peculiar position because I had information that I could not release to the press, and I tried my best to stop any investigations because I knew nothing would come of it. But the political factors came in through the city politicians, and as it turned out, more than $1 million were spent trying to prove that this family was affected by materials that are supposedly had been buried in a dump site some years before the houses were built. Well, this was totally untrue, but deep wells were done, testing of the soil, and as I say, better than $1 million was spent trying to prove that this family was affected by the environment. We knew in the health department that this was not so, and eventually it was proven to be correct. We had another outbreak.
And that was a political situation, too, and they wouldn't let you release that because there was such a strong feeling among the public? Is that that was the days still are there that was so frightening about all these poisons, which really, you know.
There was another situation very similar with the Hollywood dump.
Oh yes.
And
Yes.
again, we showed very early on that the mortality and morbidity rates in that area were actually lower than in control areas of similar population densities and makeup. Again, millions of dollars were spent on the Hollywood situation, which proved nothing in the long run. It's hard to get across epidemiological situations to people who don't understand the mechanisms that were used to prove things one way or the other.
Now this was a difficult thing from an ethical point of view of yours, because I know that you were all for coming forward and telling the situation, but I think that politically you responded to your people down at City Hall or County Hall, wherever it was, that you couldn't really come forward. Is that you want to elaborate a little bit on that for us?
Well, that was true in the Steel Street outbreak. It wasn't so true in the other one. I really didn't have much to do with the Hollywood.
But well, I guess I actually flipped back to the Steel Street one.
Yeah, sort of taken out of my hands. I started to say, what did I start to say? I was talking about the
talking about the health department.
Health department, and
actually, you were interval health.
I was interim director and medical director in interim for a little over a year while we were searching for a permanent director. This is when the Steel Street thing broke open.
She had psychiatric problems, that lady.
Well, I still hesitate to tell the whole picture because I think it's something that should not be public.
Okay, all right.
And but I knew, and this was part of my problem, was that I could not tell the public what
you knew, yeah.
And it would be giving away doctors' confidentiality, which you don't do, of course.
Okay.
It's made it interesting, but difficult. I developed the first epidemiology section in the health department. There used to be an immunology section with one nurse who served to go out and look at situations that were potential outbreaks or unusual diseases. We had one nurse there initially who was excellent at doing this, but the old system needed modernization, and I was able to do this. Dr. Eugene Fullwinkle was the director at the time, and he actually hired me to replace himself. He had formerly been in charge of the immunization and epidemiology section. But I broke these two things apart, and the epidemiology section developed a team called the EPI team, for epidemiological team, and we would meet weekly and go over reports, particularly in regard to food poisoning outbreaks. And we had some very interesting ones in Memphis. And in those days, instead of what they're doing today, is showing the results of scoring of restaurants on television every Thursday. In those days, we would have discussions as a group and frequently would close down restaurants who didn't pass the score. Uh, we ran into a number of very interesting food poisoning cases and outbreaks that were, one of them I remember was a turkey outbreak of salmonella related to women in a church cooking turkey and handing it in properly in their kitchen. We isolated the organism from the kitchen, from the utensils that were used, from the patients. So there are hundreds of different kinds of salmonellas, but every time we had the same one from the patients, from the kitchen. We went to, I didn't go, but people working on us went to Arkansas to the turkey farms and isolated it from the turkeys and from the feed. And what happens is the turkey feed got contaminated, went to the birds got contaminated, and went to the stores in Memphis, and improper food handling techniques.
That was a great case that was used as an example of epidemiology, of the pursuit of it, and with our medical students. I remember that case very well.
As a matter of fact,
You call it the turkey case.
as a matter of fact, I went annually to visit a friend of mine who was chairman of the Department of Microbiology at Shreveport, Louisiana Medical School, and I'd give that as an exercise to those students. It turned out to be a very good exercise for learning the techniques of epidemiology and how do you control things.
I think that the students didn't appreciate the potential there. I don't know whether I doubt if our current students would appreciate would appreciate it even less. But I think that it would be important for them to have an example that way. And those of us on the curriculum committee are trying to do what was done in that department by you years ago in having relatively small groups and going by case example. So things have a way of turning around, and certainly you were a pioneer in that area. There was another area that I would want you to elaborate a little bit on. Those other members of the department. You mentioned about Henry Packer. He's the one that recruited you here. Is that correct?
That's correct.
And Henry, I believe, is still alive. Is that correct?
He's up in his 90s.
Yeah. How about that? I haven't seen him in years, actually. There's another. That was Frank Roberts. You want to tell us a little bit about Frank? You mentioned something about Henry.
He actually was over in the dean's office for most of the time. He did come back to preventive medicine after he left the dean's office. I think he was an assistant dean for a while. But he was there a relatively short time, and I really didn't get to know his work very well. He, of course, hired Henry Packard. The two of them came from up around the Tri-City area in Tennessee years ago, where they were a health officer doing public health work. I don't know what their relationship was with each other at that time, but Frank Roberts was the one responsible for bringing Henry Packard to Tennessee.
Okay.
Packer had other, I think, very innovative ideas. People don't realize this, but in the early days, when I was there first in '55 on for several years, they had a section of family medicine, and Bob Davison was in charge of that. And he had a couple other physicians with him, but this was a very good teaching mechanism for general practice or family medicine. The students would inherit a family that was assigned to them and follow this family all during the quarter that they were working with them. They delivered babies, and well, they didn't actually deliver them, but they went through the delivery process with them. They took care of old people and young people, and got a very good widespread input into family practice. It was some years later that section was in preventive medicine was terminated, and some years later that family practice as a separate department was developed at UT, and is still going as far as I know.
Yes, it is, and of course, the University of Tennessee was noted for its graduates going into family medicine and I guess general practice, and then specialty services came in the late 50s, I guess, and early 60s, and then for a while we were producing more specialists than we were general practitioners, or family physicians as they're called now, or primary care physicians. But now I just noticed today that the largest number of our graduates in this last graduating class in the match were indeed going into primary care. Tell us about the quarter system. You were here sort of in its heyday, or at least some of it was. Some of your time was here when they had the quarter system. You remember how you felt it met the needs?
I really can't comment too intelligently on that, because the courses that I were taught were changed considerably over the years, and
but you had to teach them 4 times a year, at least for a while there, didn't you?
we taught 4 times a year, and I remember even when I think it was the day before Christmas Eve that I was called into the dean's. I don't think they called him the dean at that time. Hyman.
I don't know. I forgot what he was called. I don't know what
he was called. Chancellor.
No.
He wasn't
Well,
chancellor, but he functioned as a chancellor.
Yes.
Anyway, I remember being called into his office during that holiday to discuss the student problems that came up because at the end of the year they had exams, and we either passed or failed students. I was frequently on the board that decided whether or not we would pass students on from the preclinical to the clinical years. That was an interesting thing, because I always assumed that if a person went into medicine with the idea of doing good, sort of the missionary spirit, that he would make a good doctor, and those that went in for the financial gains wouldn't maybe make so good. Well, I found out that that was a fallacy, that some of the ones that had the missionary bent, they just couldn't make it, and they never would have made good physicians. Whereas those that went in for the financial gain, some of those made excellent physicians. It's against what you ordinarily would think.
Well, no, I've come to that. I've come to that conclusion too. Through the years dealing with this, the motivation, because they change. Both, as you say, the missionary they can very well become disillusioned with medicine, while the others can do exemplary medicine and be a real contributor in many, many ways. So I support your feelings about that and my own experience.
Another thing about our laboratory, our viral laboratory, is that we had almost always a student involved in it, and we had some excellent students go through our laboratory and become excellent physicians. And they almost universally felt that the experience in the laboratory was a great benefit to them in future years.
That's one thing that I think that our students are missing. There are those that are still doing some research work, but the curriculum is so crammed now that it's hard for them to work certainly on an ongoing basis, and that perhaps they have one crack at it between the first and second year for a few weeks. But this is something that I think most of our students miss, and I think that's a problem that I don't see any solution to, Bob. And I would agree with you the importance of them having an experience in the laboratory, or certainly the research approach, because medicine, for the most part, at least it is in internal medicine, is problem solving. One problem after another. That's what we expect to do. Bob, did you have some other things you wanted to do? We certainly have enjoyed hearing you.
I wanted to say that I was the first editor of the Tennessee Medical Alumnus.
Oh, that's right.
And that was an additional. The one time I actually had 4 offices, had 4 different secretaries. I was running from one to the other.
I remember those beautiful editions of that magazine, and those were in color, as I remember.
Yes,
and I think you
were.
And they were beautiful. You did a great job, and
Well,
that was put up. You did that on top of all the rest that you were doing. So I think that's another credit for you, which should be appreciated by the whole school, because you are again in a pioneering situation. And it's really developed now further, as you know.
I can't think of anything else. We did some very pioneering work as far as the laboratory, the virus laboratory is concerned. In those days, we went to the abattoir, the slaughterhouse, to get our calf serum and processed it in our laboratory, brought the blood back and processed it. Our own serum for growing tissue cultures. It was a very difficult time, because one could not, as one does today, write off and get cell cultures, and we had a large volume of them being produced at one time. So it was fun to be involved in the development of these techniques early on, and involved in isolation of new viruses early on.
Now, you mentioned about malaria, and that was Henry Packer's contribution. Well, was he here during the Second World War? Because there was a big initiative in malaria research, searching for drugs. Is that correct?
That's correct. As a matter of fact, I did my doctor's thesis at Hopkins on malaria during the war.
Your degree was a PhD. Is that what you got from?
No, it was a Doctor of Science.
That's DS, is it?
SCD.
SCD. Okay.
And it was a very rare degree. One had to have a number of qualifications in order to be qualify in the program. And there were only, I think, about 3 or 4 schools in the country that gave a
And the Hopkins was doing that? That's school hygiene at Hopkins.
Right.
What years were you there at the School of Hygiene? Can you
I
recall
went there
offhand?
in 1940. I left in 42, and I came back in 44 and went to
The medical school. We crossed there a little bit. I started medical school in 43.
Mm-hmm.
But of course, a big place like that, I don't think we had any.
I remember seeing you there, but I don't think we ever had any personal contact. But I do remember Bill Runyon.
Okay, well, good. Good. Anyway, I was in uniform at that time. I had I had a Navy uniform on, and it was embarrassing because I wasn't an officer. But you would go, of course, there were lots of sailors in the city, and you would get saluted. And at first I would say no, 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 and they wouldn't know what I was talking about. Then after a while I thought it was less embarrassing just to salute them back, but I never did deserve a salute. Okay. Bob, it's been awfully good talking with you again, and because certainly your contributions are recognized and revered there at the university, and we in the Archives and History Committee we wanted to try to get down as best we could in your own voice some of these contributions, and we do thank you for the time that you've allowed me to be in your lovely home and have a chance to chat.